I have told this story exactly 4 times in my life, and every single time I have stopped breathing at the same moment. Tonight will be the 5th time, and I already know I will stop breathing again, right when I get to the part about the door that was not a door, and the human who walked through it anyway, laughing like it was nothing. If you are looking for a story about humans winning a war, close this recording now, because there is no war in it. There is only a moon that should not exist, a hollow that remembers everything it has ever swallowed, and one small, fragile, impossibly loud creature who taught an entire species of scholars that curiosity is not the same thing as safety. My name is Oravin Thress, 3rd archivist of the Thren Accord, and I need you to understand something before I begin. I did not like humans. Not before this. Not for a long time after either. But I owe this one a debt I can never repay. And the only currency I have left to give her is the truth told exactly as it happened, starting with the day the silence came back online. The silence in my line of work is a technical term, though it sounds like poetry when you say it in Old Thren. It means a probe, a beacon, or an expedition that stops transmitting without ever sending a distress signal. No scream, no warning. Just a clean, sudden absence, as if something had reached out and simply turned the universe's volume down around one single point. Aeliss Hollow had swallowed 6 full expeditions this way over 200 cycles, and every single one of them had gone quiet at the same depth, past the same threshold, which the survey guilds had started calling the 7th gate, because nothing that passed it ever came back to tell us what the 8th looked like. I had spent 11 cycles of my life cataloging the wreckage of those 6 expeditions from orbit, sifting through the last transmitted images like a scholar picking through ash, and I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters later. I had never once gone down myself. I studied the mouth of the grave. I never stepped inside it. That changed the cycle the Conquered Exploration Guild accepted its first human members, and somebody in a records office 3 systems away decided, with what I can only assume was a truly spectacular sense of humor, that the newest, strangest, least tested species in the entire Accord should be assigned to the oldest, deadliest, least solved mystery on the books. I remember reading the transfer order twice, certain there had been a translation error. There had not been a translation error. And that is how, on a morning I will never forget, no matter how many cycles pass, I found myself standing on a landing pad with my tail curled tight around my ankle out of pure nerves, waiting to meet the creature the guild had assigned to walk beside me into a hole that had eaten 6 teams whole. She was smaller than I expected. That was the first thing. Every rumor I had heard about humans described them as towering, brutish, built like siege engines, and instead the shuttle door opened and out climbed something barely taller than a Thren juvenile, wrapped in a battered field jacket 3 sizes too big, hauling a pack that looked like it weighed more than she did. She grinned at me before she had even finished walking down the ramp, which I found deeply unsettling, because in Thren culture you do not show your teeth to a stranger unless you intend violence, and I genuinely could not tell yet if that was what this was. "You must be the archivist," she said, in a voice far too bright for someone about to descend into a graveyard. And I remember thinking, this one is going to die in the first hour, and it will be my fault for not stopping her in time. Her name was Ren Callahan, and I would learn, slowly, painfully over the following days, that she had chosen that call sign herself, on purpose, because a wren is a small brown bird from her homeworld that nests in the collapsed ruins of larger, grander things that have already fallen down. I did not understand why a person would name themselves after an insignificant scavenger bird instead of something fierce, and when I asked her, she just laughed and said, "Because the wren's still there after the ruin isn't," and I filed that answer away in the part of my mind where I keep things I do not understand yet, a drawer that, by the end of this story, would be completely full. We were not alone on the descent team, though I will admit that in my memory, everyone else has faded into background noise beside her. There was Dresk, a Thren engineer twice my age who trusted machines more than living things and said so often. There was Kamital, a Vershai pathfinder whose 4 eyes never seemed to blink at the same time, which I always found faintly nauseating to look at directly. And there was Ren, who as far as I could tell had brought absolutely no specialized equipment except a coil of ordinary rope, a notebook made of actual dead tree paper, and a small metal object she called a harmonica, which she played badly the entire time we waited for the transport doors to open. I asked her what its purpose was. She said morale, and kept playing. The mouth of Aeliss Hollow does not look like a cave. I need you to picture this correctly, because every image sent back to the surveying guilds over 200 cycles had failed to capture it. It looks like a wound that is half healed and half forgotten how. The rock around the opening is fused into smooth, glassy ridges the color of old blood, and it pulses, faintly, on a rhythm no instrument has ever been able to match to anything. Not a heartbeat, not tectonic pressure, not any mineral process my people have a name for. The first time I stood at that opening, close enough to feel warm, wet air breathing out of it against my scales, every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, and I very nearly did. And then Ren walked straight past me into the dark without even looking back to see if I was following, and I understood with a sick lurch in my stomach that I had exactly two choices left: follow her or watch her disappear the way 6 expeditions already had. The first 100 paces down were almost gentle, which I have since learned is the cruelest kind of trick a place like this can play on you. The passage widened into a chamber lit by threads of pale blue bioluminescence running through the walls, like veins under skin, and Ren stopped, turned in a slow circle with her mouth hanging open and said, "Oh, it's beautiful," in a tone of voice I can only describe as delighted, as if we had just walked into a garden instead of the mouth of something that had already killed 31 sentient beings. Dresk immediately began recording mineral composition. Kamital immediately began scanning for structural weaknesses. I immediately began cataloging every exit, because someone in this group needed to be thinking about how we would get back out. And it clearly was not going to be the human currently running her bare fingers along a glowing wall like it was a pet she'd just met. It was in that first chamber that we found the marker left by the second expedition, the one that had made it furthest before going silent. A Versailles beacon flag, still standing, its light long dead, planted at the base of a passage that split 3 ways deeper into the rock. Kamital went very still when we found it, all 4 eyes fixed on the flag, and told us, in a voice with none of its usual dry humor, that the last transmission from that expedition had come from exactly this spot, and had lasted 4 seconds, and had contained no words at all, only the sound of something the recording equipment had never been able to identify. I asked what the sound was. Kamital said it sounded like breathing. Ren asked to hear it. I told her that was an extremely unwise request. She asked again anyway, and something about the way she asked, not fearless, I understood later, just refusing to let fear make the decision for her, made Kamital play the recording, and all 4 of us stood in that glowing chamber listening to something enormous breathe in the dark 200 cycles ago, and none of us said a word for a long, long time. We chose the left passage, mostly because Ren said the middle one felt wrong, which Dresk scoffed at openly, informing her that instinct was not a survey methodology, and I remember being surprised when Kamital sided with her instead, saying that a Versailles Pathfinder's entire career was built on instincts machines couldn't replicate, and that if the human felt something, it was worth respecting even without proof. I did not know yet that this would become the pattern of our entire descent. The human feeling something first, the rest of us arguing about whether feelings counted as data, and then, almost every single time, discovering far too late that she had been right. The left passage sloped downward at an angle steep enough that we had to use Ren's rope, which she produced from her pack with the casual efficiency of someone who had tied that particular knot 10,000 times before, looping it around a stone formation and testing it with her full weight before any of the rest of us were permitted to touch it. I asked her, somewhat defensively, whether she doubted our engineering. She said no, she just doubted gravity, which made no sense to me at the time, and made a great deal of sense about an hour later, when the passage floor beneath Dresk's feet simply ceased to exist without warning, and only Ren's rope and Ren's own body weight thrown backward against the anchor point kept him from vanishing into a darkness so complete that even our lights couldn't find its bottom. Dresk did not speak for several minutes after that, which for Dresk was practically a religious experience. When he finally did speak, it was to ask Ren, quietly, how she had known the floor was going to fail, and she said something I have thought about many times since. That the light patterns on the walls had changed color 3 paces before it happened, subtly, in a way that meant the mineral veins running through the stone were reacting to something below us shifting position, and that on her homeworld, hunters learned to read a forest's silence the same way. Because the things that wanted to eat you never announced themselves. They just changed the world slightly around where they were hiding. I asked her how she had learned to notice such a subtle warning sign in an alien environment she had never seen before in her life. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Same rules as home. Something's always paying attention to you. You just have to pay attention back." And I remember thinking that this was either the wisest thing I had ever heard or the most terrifying. And to this day, I am still not certain which. We made camp that first night. If night means anything in a place with no sun. In a hollow off the main passage that Kamatal's Pathfinder senses insisted was structurally stable, and it was there that Ren did something that struck all 3 of us as almost unbearably strange. She took out her notebook, the paper one, and began to draw. Not a map, though there was a map in there too. She drew the chamber we'd first entered, the glowing veins in the walls, the dead beacon flag, rendering it all in quick, confident lines by hand on dead tree paper in a hole in the ground that had killed 31 people. Dresk asked why she wasn't using a recording drone like the rest of us. She said drones remembered everything and understood nothing, and that if she drew a thing with her own hand, she had to actually look at it first, really look. And sometimes that was the only way you noticed the detail that mattered. I did not understand this either, not then. I understand it now. And it is one of the reasons I am telling you this story, instead of simply filing another report. The second day is when the passage began to change in ways that none of the previous expedition's logs had prepared us for. Because, we would later realize, none of them had survived long enough to document it. The bioluminescent veins in the walls, which had been a constant, gentle blue since the entrance, began to shift toward violet the deeper we went, and the air grew warmer and thicker, carrying a mineral smell that Kamatal described as wrong in a way I don't have a word for, which from a Vershai Pathfinder is essentially a scream of alarm. We began finding side chambers carved with patterns, not natural formations, not random mineral growth, but deliberate, repeating geometric shapes etched into stone that should not have been capable of holding that fine a detail without machining. And there was no evidence anywhere that anything with hands had ever been down here to carve them. It was Ren who noticed that the patterns were not random. And it was Ren who noticed it because she was the only one of us treating this expedition like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a hazard to be survived. Sketching the etchings into her notebook chamber after chamber, holding pages up side by side under her light and frowning at them with an intensity that made Dresk mutter that she was wasting time we did not have to spare. She ignored him completely, which I was beginning to understand was simply how she operated when she believed she was right. And after the 4th chamber she went very quiet and turned her notebook around to show us and said 4 words that I still hear in my sleep sometimes. "It's the same door." I want to explain what she meant because it took the rest of us far too long to understand it. Every chamber we had passed through, going all the way back to the entrance, contained one instance of the same central pattern, a spiral inside a broken ring, always in a slightly different position within the room, always oriented at a slightly different angle. Ren's theory, offered with far more confidence than any of us felt comfortable with, was that these were not decorations. They were instructions. A sequence. And she believed, without any way to prove it yet, that the pattern was trying to teach whoever walked this passage how to open something much larger, much further down, and that the 6 expeditions who had died here had simply walked past the lesson without ever realizing class was in session. Dresk called this speculation dressed up as insight. Kamatal, to my genuine surprise, said it was the single most useful theory anyone had proposed about Aeliss Hollow in 200 cycles of failed survey missions, and that we should test it before dismissing it because testing a theory cost us nothing but time, and we had already spent 200 cycles losing lives to the alternative of not testing anything at all. I found myself, against every professional instinct in my body, agreeing with the human, and that was the first moment I understood that something in me had already started to shift quietly, without my permission. Before we ever reached that seventh chamber, though, there was a night I have never told anyone about in any of my previous 4 tellings of this story, and I am only telling it now because I think you deserve to understand exactly how close we came to losing her before the Hollow ever gave up a single one of its secrets. It happened on the second night, in a passage barely wide enough for 2 of us to walk abreast, when the ground cover along the tunnel floor, a thin, mossy growth none of us had thought twice about since it carpeted nearly every surface we had crossed since the entrance, suddenly rippled beneath Kamital's feet in a way that had nothing to do with wind or footsteps at all, and folded upward around his ankles like a hand closing. I want to be honest about how fast it happened, because I think that is the part people struggle to picture. One moment, Kamital was walking 2 paces ahead of me, complaining, as he often did, about the humidity affecting his sensor calibration. The next moment, he was on the ground, and the moss, if it was moss, and I no longer believe it was, had climbed to his knees and was pulling, steadily, patiently, toward a crack in the tunnel wall barely wide enough to swallow a limb, let alone a body. And yet it did not seem remotely concerned about that fact, dragging him toward it anyway with a slow, mindless persistence that was somehow far more frightening than if it had simply lunged. Dresk froze. I froze. I want to admit that plainly, because it is easy, telling this story afterward, to make it sound as though only the human ever hesitated in this entire account, and that would be a lie designed to make the rest of us look braver than we were. I had 11 cycles of studying wreckage from orbit, and exactly 0 cycles of experience with a threat that behaved like patient, hungry gravity, and in that half-second of paralysis, it was Ren who moved, dropping to her knees beside Kamital without a single word of hesitation, and driving the edge of her climbing pick directly into the moss at the point where it gripped his leg, not stabbing wildly, but cutting along a specific line, fast and precise, the way you'd cut a rope under tension rather than hack at it randomly. And I remember thinking, even in the middle of my own terror, that this was not the reaction of someone improvising. This was the reaction of someone who had done something like this before. The moss did not simply release him. It recoiled sharply, drawing back along the tunnel floor and up the wall in a rippling retreat that left faint violet afterglow trailing behind it. And for one horrible moment I believed it had only paused, gathering itself for a second attempt, and Ren must have believed the same thing because she did not relax, did not sheath the pick, simply stood over Kamital with her light raised and her whole body angled between him and the retreating growth until it had vanished entirely back into the crack in the wall, and the tunnel had gone still and silent again. Only then did she kneel back down, check his leg for damage, and mutter, mostly to herself, "There's always something underneath the pretty parts. Always." I asked her once we were moving again how she had known exactly where to cut, and she told me, in a voice quieter than I had heard from her yet, that she had grown up on a coastline where certain shallow water plants did something almost identical to unwary swimmers, and that her mother had taught her, very young, never to fight the grip itself, only the point where it was anchored, because panic wastes the only window you get. It was the first time she had mentioned her mother, and something in the careful, clipped way she said the word told me not to ask further, not yet, and so I filed it away in that same drawer of things I did not understand, which by now was beginning to feel considerably less empty than it had 3 days earlier. Sleep did not come easily after that, not for me, and I found myself sitting apart from the others near the edge of our small camp, watching Ren clean and recoil her rope with the same methodical calm she brought to everything, and I finally asked her the question I had been circling since the landing pad: why a person would volunteer for an orphan contract, a mission every other species in the Concord had quietly agreed was a death sentence dressed up as employment. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all, and then she told me that her mother had been a cave diver back on their homeworld, mapping flooded systems too dangerous for most people to enter twice, and that she had gone into one such system when Ren was very young and simply never surfaced, and that no expedition ever went back down to find out why, because the risk was judged too high, and the loss already too final to justify it. She said she had spent her whole life afterward furious at a universe that let places like that stay unanswered, and that when the Concord opened its doors to her species and offered contracts nobody else wanted, she had signed for every single one of them, not because she wanted to die the way her mother had, but because she refused to let one more silence go uninvestigated if she had any power at all to change that. I did not know what to say to her. I am not certain there was anything to say. I simply sat with her, in the dark, until the light along the walls dimmed to its lowest resting glow, and I understood for the first time that the thing driving this small, reckless creature forward through a hole that had swallowed 31 lives was not fearlessness at all. It was grief that had decided, a long time ago, to become useful, instead of letting itself curdle into something smaller. We found the 7th chamber on the morning of the 3rd day, and I recognized it immediately, because I had spent 11 cycles of my career staring at the last transmitted image from it. This was the 7th gate, the threshold no expedition had ever crossed and lived to describe. It did not look like a gate. It looked like an enormous iris, easily 30 times my own height, carved in concentric rings of dark stone, shot through with the same violet bioluminescence, closed shut like an eye that had decided it did not wish to see us. And etched around its outer ring, larger and more elaborate than anything we had found before, was the same spiral and broken ring pattern Ren had been tracking for 2 full days, except here, finally, it was complete. Dresk wanted to force it open with charges. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it tells you exactly what kind of mistake had likely killed at least one of the 6 previous expeditions, and Ren's reaction to the suggestion was the sharpest I had ever seen her, snapping that you do not blow open a door someone left you a key to. And when Dresk demanded to know where exactly this supposed key was, she pointed to the pattern and said the answer had been staring at us since the entrance and that the sequence wasn't a lock. It was a rhythm, and the gate wasn't meant to be forced. It was meant to be answered. What happened next is the part of this story that still makes my hands shake slightly when I recount it. Because Ren Callahan, small, unarmored, carrying nothing but a coil of rope and a notebook and a battered metal harmonica, stepped up to the largest iris door in the entire hollow, the one that had swallowed 31 lives whole, and began, very deliberately, to play. She had noticed something none of the rest of us had thought to check, that the spacing between the spiral marks, when converted into intervals, matched almost exactly the tonal pattern of the recording Camutal had played us on the first night, the 4-second sound the second expedition had transmitted before going silent forever. The sound none of our instruments could identify, the sound that had chilled all of us into silence. She believed it was not a scream. She believed it was a call. And so she raised that small tin instrument to her lips in front of a door that had killed 31 people, and she answered it. I do not have adequate words in any language I speak to describe what happened when the last note faded. The violet light running through the iris door did not simply brighten. It moved, rippling outward from the center like water disturbed by a stone, and a low vibration passed through the stone floor beneath our feet that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears. And Dresk grabbed for his weapon, and Camutal grabbed for Dresk, and Ren did not move at all, standing perfectly still with the harmonica still raised halfway to her mouth, watching the door the way you would watch someone finally waking up after a very long sleep. The iris did not open like a door swings open. It unfolded ring by ring in the exact reverse sequence of the pattern etched around its edge, each ring rotating and receding into the stone with a sound like enormous stone teeth grinding very, very slowly apart. And behind it, past a threshold no living being had crossed in 200 cycles, was not a passage and not a chamber, but a light so vast and so soft that for a moment, I genuinely believed we had somehow walked out from underground into a second hidden sky. Nobody moved for a long time. I remember Dresk's breathing, ragged and fast beside me. I remember Camutal's 4 eyes all fixed for once, on the exact same point. And I remember Ren lowering the harmonica from her lips, turning to look at the 3 of us with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. Not triumph, not relief, but something closer to grief, and saying very quietly, I think we just answered something that's been calling for help for 200 years and nobody ever picked up. And I want you to understand that in that moment, standing at the threshold of the 8th gate, staring into a light that no expedition had lived to describe, every single thing I believed about this mystery, and about this small, strange creature standing beside me, quietly rearranged itself. We stepped through together because none of us, not even Dresk, was willing to let Ren go first alone again. And what waited on the other side of that impossible light was not a graveyard. It was a garden, or something that had once been a garden, vast and cavernous, its ceiling lost somewhere far overhead in a haze of drifting violet motes that behaved less like dust and more like slow, patient snow. Enormous stone structures rose out of soft, luminous ground cover in shapes that were unmistakably architectural, unmistakably built by careful, deliberate hands, and utterly unlike anything catalogued anywhere in the Concord's records, curved and layered like the inside of some vast fossilized shell. And scattered across that cavern, half swallowed by centuries of that same soft, luminous growth, we found them. The remains of 6 expeditions, laid out not as wreckage, not as carnage, but arranged, almost tenderly, in careful rows along the base of the largest structure, equipment intact, bodies undisturbed, as if something enormous and patient had simply gathered up everyone who ever fell into its garden and set them down gently to rest, rather than devouring them at all. Dresk's voice, when he finally spoke, came out barely above a whisper, asking the question all 3 of us were too afraid to say out loud. If this thing hadn't killed them, then what had silenced every single transmission the instant they crossed this threshold? And it was Ren, crouching beside the nearest fallen explorer with a gentleness that startled me, who noticed the answer first. A thin, translucent membrane, almost invisible, still faintly pulsing with residual violet light, wrapped delicately around the dead explorer's communication equipment and every single piece of equipment beside every single body in that entire garden. She did not call it a parasite. She did not call it a weapon. She looked up at me, at Dresk, at Kamital, with an expression of dawning, horrified understanding, and said the thing had not silenced them to kill them quietly. It had silenced them because it did not want to be found by the people who would have come after, armed, afraid, ready to burn the whole hollow down at the first sign of danger. And I remember, in that moment, feeling the floor of my certainty about this entire mystery drop away beneath me exactly like the passage floor had dropped away beneath Dresk 2 days before. Because if that was true, this thing had been protecting itself from us for 200 cycles, and it had just let the 4 of us walk straight into the deepest part of its heart. That is when the ground beneath the garden began very slowly to breathe. I do not mean this metaphorically. The soft, luminous ground cover across the entire cavern floor rose and fell, gently, rhythmically, exactly matching the pulse we had felt at the entrance 3 days earlier. And I understood, with a lurch of vertigo that nearly took my legs out from under me, that we had not been walking toward the center of a structure this entire time. We had been walking into the center of something alive, something so vast that its rock and stone architecture and its living tissue had become the same substance over however many thousands of cycles it had lain here, undisturbed, waiting. Kamital's 4 eyes fixed on something rising slowly from the center of the garden, past the rows of gently arranged dead, and none of us could quite make ourselves speak as we watched a column of that violet light gather itself upward, folding and unfolding through shapes that almost resembled a body and then dissolved again before settling, before our eyes, into something that might have been meant to look familiar to us. Vaguely Thren, vaguely Vershai, vaguely human, as if whatever it was had reached into all our minds at once and built itself an approximation of a face it hoped none of us would find alarming. And I have never in my life felt more certain that I was about to die, and more certain that running would accomplish absolutely nothing. It did not attack. It did not speak, not in any language, not in any sound at all. Instead, images began arriving directly behind my eyes, not painful, not violent, but overwhelming. A flood of memory that was not mine. A world above us that no longer existed. A species that had built this hollow as a vault and a nursery, and a final refuge all at once when their star began dying far too fast for any of them to survive its end. An ark not of ships but of stone and light and living memory, meant to hold everything they were until someone someday came looking. And I understood, watching those images pour past behind my eyes faster than I could process them, that every single expedition before ours had been swallowed not out of malice but out of grief, because this thing had spent 200 cycles alone with the memory of an entire dead civilization, terrified that the next visitors would either steal that memory as a weapon or simply fail to understand it was there at all, and simply seal the hollow shut and walk away. Ren was the one who stepped forward, past all three of us, close enough that the drifting violet light caught in her hair like sparks, and said the words that I believe, to this day, are the actual reason any of us are still alive to tell this story. We're not here to take anything from you. We're here because you called and it took us 200 years to learn how to listen. We're sorry it took so long. And the enormous, grieving, patient thing that had built itself a face out of our own memories simply stood there, in the drifting light for a long, long moment, and then, very slowly, folded down toward her, not as a threat, but the way you would kneel down to look a small child directly in the eye. And I watched a being built from the entire dead memory of a vanished civilization choose, out of every creature in that garden, to trust the smallest and least armored one of us completely. What followed I can only describe as a conversation, though no words were exchanged in any tongue any recording device in our equipment could capture, and I do not fully understand, even now, how Ren managed to hold up her end of it, except that she later told me it felt like remembering someone else's life instead of hearing it, image by image, grief by grief, and that the hardest part was not being frightened by any of it, but simply staying still long enough to let it finish. Hour after hour passed this way in that cavern of drifting light, while Dresk and Kamatal and I stood frozen at the threshold, afraid to interrupt something none of us understood, watching a creature built from centuries of loneliness slowly, carefully, unclench itself in front of the one member of our team small enough, strange enough, and stubborn enough to have never once, in 3 full days underground, treated this place as an enemy to be defeated instead of a mystery to be understood. When it was finally over, Ren turned back to us with tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away, and told us 3 things that I have never forgotten and never will. The first was that the Vault Keeper, as she called it, was not a weapon and had never been one, and was in fact dying, slowly, the way all things die when they have been alone with grief for far too long, without anyone to share the weight of it. The second was that it did not want to be freed, or fixed, or studied, or rescued in any of the ways the Concord's protocols would have insisted on if we simply reported this as a hazard to be neutralized. It wanted, more than anything else in its long, strange existence, to be witnessed, to have what it carried finally seen and understood and carried forward by someone, anyone, so that the civilization it had preserved for 200 cycles in total isolation would not simply vanish the moment it finally, inevitably stopped breathing. And the third thing she told us quietly, in a voice that cracked in a way I had never heard from her before across 3 days of falling floors and vanishing light and doors that ate 31 lives whole, was that it had shown her something else, buried deep beneath all that grief, that 6 previous expeditions had not failed. They had simply never been asked the right question, by the right person, and none of them had ever thought to stop being afraid of it for long enough to listen. I have not yet told you about the hour immediately after Ren rose from that long, silent conversation with the Vault Keeper, because I did not fully understand what I was watching until much later, and I want to give it to you the way I finally came to understand it myself. She did not simply stand up and announce what she had learned. She sat back down again almost immediately, legs folding beneath her in the soft, luminous ground cover. And for a long moment, she simply pressed both palms flat against the floor of that garden, the way you might rest your hands against the chest of someone breathing unsteadily. And Dresk, of all of us, was the one who finally broke the silence by asking, in a voice stripped of every ounce of his usual clipped professionalism, whether she was hurt. She said no. She said she was just letting it know we were still there, because 200 cycles of silence teaches a mind, however vast, however ancient, that the moment attention arrives it will also inevitably leave again. And she did not want the first true conversation this thing had ever had to end the instant it stopped being convenient for us. I remember Kamital's 4 eyes finally, for once, all fixing on the same point at the exact same time. And I remember thinking that whatever measure of trust the Vault Keeper had extended to her, she was determined to return in full, with interest. It was nearly 2 full days before we made our way back up through the hollow, not because the passage had become any less treacherous, but because Ren refused to leave until she had done something the Vault Keeper had never once, in 200 cycles, been offered by anyone who found it. She asked it to teach her its name. Not a designation, not a function, not the sterile classification our survey guild would eventually assign it for the official record, but the actual sound its long-dead creators had once used. And I watched her spend the better part of an afternoon simply sitting in that drifting violet light, shaping her mouth around syllables no human throat had been built to produce, failing, laughing quietly at her own failure, and trying again, until something in the light around her shifted, gently, approvingly, and she told us afterward that she still could not pronounce it correctly, not really, but that being willing to try badly in front of it again and again had mattered more than getting it right ever could have. When we finally did climb back toward the surface, the hollow itself seemed different beneath our boots, though I have spent long cycles since trying to decide whether that was truly the moon changing, or simply the 4 of us seeing it differently now that we were no longer afraid of what waited at its heart. The violet veins in the walls, which had pulsed with a slow, mournful rhythm on the way down, seemed steadier now, calmer, the way a person's breathing settles once they have finally said the thing they have been carrying alone for far too long. Dresk, ever the engineer, insisted this was simply confirmation bias. Kamital disagreed quietly, and for once I found myself siding with the Pathfinder rather than the machine truster, because I had felt that same shift in my own chest, and I did not believe for a moment that it was imagination. We did not blow the hollow open when we returned to the surface. We did not report it at first as a hazard, or a ruin, or a threat, though I know that somewhere in the Concord's endless archives there are officials who will always regret that we didn't. Instead, over the following cycles, a very different kind of expedition began making the descent through Aeliss Hollow. Archivists, historians, artists, storytellers from a dozen species, walking down through that same violet-lit passage not to conquer it or dismantle it, but to sit in that garden of gently arranged fallen explorers and let the Vault Keeper finally, after 200 cycles of silence, tell someone its story, over and over, to as many listeners as it needed until the weight of carrying an entire dead civilization alone no longer felt quite so unbearably heavy. I do not know even now whether the Vault Keeper is still alive down there in the dark, or whether it finally, gently, let itself stop, having been witnessed enough times to trust that it would not be forgotten. I have not gone back to check. I am not certain I want to know the answer. What I do know is that I stood on the surface of that world afterward, beside a small, exhausted, grinning human, wrapped in a jacket 3 sizes too big for her, and I asked her, honestly, how she had known from the very first chamber that this place was not the grave everyone else believed it to be, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gently amused at how long it had taken me to ask, and she said, "I didn't know. I just figured something that lonely deserved to be asked a question before we decided it deserved to be feared. And I have carried that sentence with me through every single expedition I have led since, into every dark, silent, terrifying place the galaxy has ever handed my species to catalog, because I learned something, in that garden of drifting violet light, that no amount of scholarship had ever taught me in 11 cycles of studying the wreckage of braver beings than myself, that the difference between a monster and a mystery is very often nothing more than whether anyone was brave enough, or foolish enough, or simply kind enough to stop being afraid long enough to listen. That is why when people ask me what humans are actually like, I no longer answer with the things I was taught to believe before I met one properly, that they are reckless, that they are loud, that they do not understand danger the way the rest of us do. I tell them instead about a small woman with a tin harmonica and a notebook full of hand-drawn spirals who walked into a hole that had swallowed 31 lives, and instead of asking how to survive it, asked what it needed. And I tell them that I have never, in all my cycles since, met another species quite so willing to stand at the edge of the unknown and simply say, out loud, to whatever waits in the dark, "We hear you, and we are not leaving until you know it." And every single time I reach this part of the story, I stop breathing for just a moment, because I am back in that garden again, watching a grieving, ancient, patient thing kneel down to meet the gaze of the smallest, least armored creature in the room, and choosing, out of everyone, to trust her completely. And I think, if I am honest, that is the real reason this story has never once left me, the same person who first walked down into that hollow, certain I was about to watch a fragile little human die for absolutely nothing. She didn't die. She listened. And in the end, that turned out to be the only weapon this particular darkness had ever truly needed. I saw Ren Callahan only twice more after that expedition ended, both times briefly, both times in transit between contracts she had already lined up before the ink on the Aeliss Hollow report had even dried, because as it turned out, word travels fast in a guild starved for good news, and every silence in the Concord's records that had once been marked unsolvable suddenly had a very small, very persistent human volunteering to go answer it. The second time I saw her, she was thinner, more tired, with a new scar along one forearm she waved off before I could even finish asking about it, and she told me, almost in passing, about a drowned world 3 systems over where something ancient had been humming the same 3 notes into the dark for longer than anyone could measure, and how she thought, this time, she might finally have the right instrument to answer back. I asked her if she was ever afraid. Doing this, over and over, walking toward every silence the rest of the galaxy had agreed to leave alone. She thought about it longer than I expected before answering, and then she said that fear had never really been the problem. The problem was always deciding, every single time, that the fear did not get to make the choice for her, and that she had made her peace with never fully answering the one silence she actually wanted answered, because her mother's flooded cave was sealed now, collapsed, unreachable, and no expedition would ever go down to find out what final thing she had seen before the water finally took her. She said that every hollow she walked into afterward was, in some small way, an apology to a woman who never got the chance to be listened to, the way the Vault Keeper finally had been, and I did not know, in that moment, how to tell her that I thought that was the bravest and saddest thing I had ever heard. So I simply told her that I hoped wherever her mother's silence had gone, it had not been alone in it either. I think of that conversation often now, whenever the Accord assigns me a new archivist fresh out of training, wide-eyed and certain that caution is the same thing as wisdom, because I was exactly that scholar once, standing at the mouth of Aeliss Hollow with my tail curled around my ankle, certain that the correct response to the unknown was distance, careful measurement, and enough good sense to never actually walk inside. I tell them all, every single one, about the small human with a tin harmonica and a notebook full of spirals, and I tell them that the difference between the 6 expeditions who died in that hollow and the one that finally lived to walk back out was never courage in the way our cultures had always defined it. It was never the absence of fear, and it was certainly never physical strength. Because if this had come down to strength alone, Ren Callahan would have been the very first of us to die, not the reason the rest of us survived. What made the difference every single time it mattered, in that mossy tunnel, and at the base of that iris door, and in the long, silent hours she spent convincing a grieving, ancient mind that it was finally safe to be witnessed, was her absolute refusal to let terror decide, on her behalf, that a mystery deserved to remain a monster. The Vault Keeper of Aeliss Hollow is, as far as I know, still down there, in that garden of drifting violet light, no longer alone, visited now by a slow, steady stream of scholars and storytellers who come not to conquer it, but to sit with it. The way you would sit with someone who has finally, after 200 long cycles, been allowed to stop holding their breath. I do not know if it is truly at peace. I am not certain such a thing can ever be measured from the outside, by a species that only spent a handful of days in its company. But I know that the last time anyone descended through that passage and returned, the light along the walls was steady and warm and utterly unafraid, and I choose, because I have earned the right to choose after everything I watched happen in that garden, to believe that means something good. So that is the story, told for the 5th time now, and I will stop breathing again in a moment, right after I say this last part, the way I always do. If you ever find yourself standing at the mouth of something the rest of the galaxy has already agreed to call a grave, a silence nobody else was brave enough to walk into, a door nobody else was patient enough to answer, I hope you remember that the smallest, least armored creature in the room is very often the one who is never actually afraid of the dark itself, only afraid of what might be lost if nobody ever bothered to listen to what was hiding inside it. And I hope, when your own moment comes, that you have the sense to follow her in anyway.